All right, so get ready because today we are going deep into a literary classic.
Oh, yeah.
That people are still talking about over a century later. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. And we're going to take you way beyond just the surface of this really chilling tale.
Yeah.
You might be surprised at how relevant it feels even today.
Absolutely. We'll be exploring an audiobook recording from the YouTube channel Gates of Imagination.
Okay.
But this is about so much more than just the plot.
Right.
Think of this deep dive as like unlocking a secret code hidden within the story, a code that speaks volumes about mental health, gender roles, and the stifling expectations that were placed upon women even, today.
Okay, so let's start by setting the scene.
Okay.
The story unfolds in a rented summer mansion.
Right.
And right away you get this sense of unease.
Yeah.
The narrator describes it as having a queer feeling, which immediately sets the tone.
It does. What's so fascinating is how Gilman uses the setting to subtly mirror the narrator's internal state.
Oh, okay. We have this beautiful mansion with a delicious garden and grates-covered arbors.
Nice.
But there are also these jarring elements.
Okay.
Locked gates, separate houses for the staff, and abandoned greenhouses. It's almost like the beauty itself is tainted, decaying.
You know what it reminds me of?
Yeah.
It reminds me of those like old Gothic novels.
Yes.
Where the house is practically a character itself, full of secrets and foreshadowing what's to come.
Totally.
But beyond the setting, the story really digs into the medical understanding of women's health back in the late 19th century.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Of course, back then, women's concerns were often dismissed as hysteria.
Wow.
The narrator is diagnosed with temporary nervous depression, which in itself is quite a loaded term.
Yeah.
And what's the prescribed cure? The infamous rest cure.
So instead of like addressing the root cause of her distress, they essentially lock her away, right?
Basically, isolate her and restrict any activities that might be considered stimulating.
Right.
It sounds almost counterintuitive to what someone struggling with their mental health might actually need.
Exactly. It was believed that complete inactivity and isolation would somehow soothe the female mind. But in reality, as we see in the story, this cure often exacerbated the very issues it claimed to treat.
Right.
And this is where John, the narrator's physician husband, enters the picture.
Okay.
He's portrayed as this man of science, dismissing anything that can't be empirically proven.
And he controls every aspect of the narrator's life, doesn't he?
He does.
I mean, he even picks out what she wears.
Yeah.
And dictates her daily schedule.
He does. And while this might seem caring on the surface, it actually contributes to her feeling infantilized and stripped of her agency.
Wow.
It's a classic example of patriarchal control disguised as love and concern.
And this power dynamic.
Yeah.
This control becomes really evident when we get to the description of the nursery.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, that wallpaper.
Right.
It's almost like stepping into a nightmare, isn't it?
It is. The nursery itself is large and airy.
Okay.
It's a former nursery.
Okay.
Yet there are barred windows that immediately evoke a sense of imprisonment.
Right.
But the wallpaper is where Gilman's genius truly shines.
Okay.
It's described in such visceral terms: a smoldering, unclean yellow, lurid orange, sickly sulfur.
Oh, wow.
With a pattern that's sprawling and flamboyant.
It sounds utterly repulsive.
It does.
And yet it becomes this focal point for the narrator.
Right.
An obsession that consumes her thoughts.
Yes.
What do you think Gilman is trying to convey through this fixation on the wallpaper?
I think the wallpaper becomes this really powerful symbol.
Okay.
It functions on multiple levels. So on one hand, it represents the domestic sphere to which women were confined, their lives limited to the walls of their homes.
Yeah.
But it also symbolizes the narrator's deteriorating mental state.
Okay.
The more she fixates on the wallpaper, the more she starts to see shapes in it. Specifically, a woman trapped behind the pattern.
That's where it gets really creepy for me. It's like she's projecting her own feelings of being trapped onto this inanimate object.
Right.
The fact that the wallpaper changes with the light shifting and morphing mirrors her own increasingly fragmented mental state.
Precisely. It's a brilliant use of symbolism to illustrate how her perception of reality is becoming distorted.
Yeah.
How her sanity is slowly unraveling under the weight of her confinement and John's suffocating control.
And this control, this sense of being trapped and silenced, eventually pushes her towards a kind of rebellion, doesn't it?
It does, and that rebellion manifests itself in a rather unexpected way.
Okay.
We see her start to secretly peel off the wallpaper.
Oh, wow.
She believes she's freeing this trapped woman,
Right.
but it's also symbolic of her own desperate attempt to break free from the constraints imposed upon her.
And her actions become more and more erratic.
Right.
Culminating in that final scene where she identifies completely with the woman in the wallpaper.
Yes.
John finds her creeping around the room, claiming to have finally gotten out, but at what cost?
That ending is intentionally ambiguous, leaving us to grapple with the question of who is truly mad and who is free.
Right.
Has the narrator achieved some kind of liberation through madness, or has she succumbed to the very forces that sought to confine her?
It's such a chilling and thought-provoking ending.
It is.
And we'll definitely be unpacking it further as we go deeper into this story.
Right.
But first, let's take a closer look at the significance of the wallpaper itself.
Okay.
How it functions as more than just a decorative element.
Absolutely. We need to delve into the specific details of its description.
Yeah.
The symbolism of the color yellow, the way the pattern evolves, and how all of that connects to the larger themes of gender roles and mental health in the story.
Great.
You know, it's interesting how the color yellow itself plays such a significant role in the story. It wasn't just a random choice by Gilman.
Now that you mention it, yellow is often associated with like sickness, decay, even madness.
Right.
It's definitely not a color that evokes feelings of peace or tranquility.
Exactly. And remember how the narrator describes the wallpaper? Smoldering, unclean, sickly.
Right.
These words all kind of point to this sense of something being wrong, off balance.
Okay.
The yellow wallpaper becomes like a visual representation of her deteriorating mental state.
Yeah.
Reflecting the toxicity of her environment and the cure that's actually making her worse.
And the pattern itself.
Right.
It's not just any random design.
No.
It's described as sprawling, flamboyant, committing every artistic sin.
Yes.
It's almost as if it's mocking her, challenging her sanity.
It is, and I think that's intentional on Gilman's part.
Okay.
The wallpaper represents not only the physical confinement of the domestic sphere,
Right.
but also the constraints that are placed on women's minds and creativity.
Yeah.
Remember, the narrator is forbidden from writing, from engaging in any intellectual pursuits.
Yeah.
This suppression of her creative outlet further contributes to her mental decline.
It's like the wallpaper is a manifestation of all those societal expectations that are crushing her spirit.
Yes.
And the more she looks at it,
Right.
the more she sees that trapped woman,
Yeah.
a reflection of herself.
Precisely. The woman behind the pattern becomes a symbol of her own entrapment, both physically and mentally.
Right.
And the act of peeling the wallpaper, freeing the woman, becomes this powerful metaphor for her own desperate yearning for liberation.
But it's a twisted kind of liberation, isn't it?
It is.
Because her escape comes through madness.
Right.
Through rejecting the very reality that's oppressing her.
That's the tragedy of the story.
Yeah.
It highlights the extreme measures that women were often driven to in a society that denied them agency and autonomy.
Wow.
It's a scathing critique of the medical practices of the time, particularly the rest cure, which was often prescribed for women suffering from nervous conditions.
And it makes you wonder how much of her illness was a genuine ailment versus like a product of her environment and the treatment she received.
That ambiguity is crucial to understanding Gilman's message.
Yeah.
She wanted to challenge the very notion of what constituted madness in women.
Right.
Was it an inherent flaw, or was it a consequence of being silenced, ignored, and controlled?
It's like the wallpaper itself is a metaphor for the invisible walls that society erects around women.
Yes.
The expectations and limitations that can drive them to the brink.
It is.
And what's so striking is that this story, written over a century ago, still resonates with us today.
It does, because sadly, many of those same societal pressures still exist.
Wow.
Women continue to face challenges in being heard and having their experiences and mental health concerns taken seriously.
Yeah.
Gilman's story serves as this powerful reminder that we need to constantly question these structures to challenge the status quo and advocate for greater understanding and empathy.
It's a call to action, isn't it?
It is.
Not just to recognize these issues, but to actively work towards dismantling them.
Yes.
To create a world where women are truly free to be themselves.
Yeah.
To express their creativity and to live authentically without being labeled as hysterical or mad.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not just about analyzing a piece of literature.
Okay.
It's about connecting it to our own lives.
Okay.
To the wallpaper that might be holding us back, the invisible barriers that limit our potential.
You know, it's funny. When we first started talking about this story, I thought it would be just a fascinating exploration of a classic piece of literature.
Yeah.
But now I see it as so much more.
Oh, wow.
It's a mirror reflecting back at us the societal norms and expectations that we often take for granted.
That's the power of great literature.
Yeah.
It can challenge our perspectives, expose uncomfortable truths, and inspire us to think differently about the world and our place within it.
So as we move towards the end of our deep dive,
Okay.
let's bring this back to you, our listener.
Okay.
Think about your own life.
Yeah.
What wallpaper might be holding you back?
What expectations, what limitations are you accepting without question? Perhaps it's a job you hate, a relationship that's draining you,
Wow.
or even just a limiting belief about yourself that's preventing you from pursuing your dreams.
Take a moment to reflect on those invisible walls that might be surrounding you,
Yeah.
and consider how you might start peeling them away,
Right.
just like the narrator in the Yellow Wallpaper.
It's a journey of self-discovery, a process of questioning, challenging, and ultimately breaking free from those constraints that are holding you back from living a truly authentic and fulfilling life.
You know, it's amazing how such a seemingly simple story centered around this woman trapped in a room with hideous wallpaper
Right.
can spark such profound introspection.
It is, and that's a testament to Gilman's artistry. She masterfully uses symbolism and metaphor to explore complex themes that continue to resonate with us over a century later.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Yeah.
From the historical context of the rest cure
Yeah.
to the symbolism of the wallpaper itself.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
We have. There are so many layers to unpack, so many nuances to explore.
Right.
For instance, we haven't even touched upon the significance of the narrator being nameless
Oh, yeah.
throughout the story.
Yeah.
That in itself speaks volumes about her lack of identity, her erasure within a patriarchal society.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And it also makes me think about the ending,
Right.
which we briefly discussed.
Yeah.
It's left intentionally ambiguous,
Yeah, it is.
leaving us to ponder who is truly mad and who is free.
Right. On one hand,
Yeah.
you could argue that by embracing the woman in the wallpaper, the narrator achieves a kind of twisted liberation. She breaks free from the constraints of her reality, rejecting the societal norms that have been imposed upon her.
Right.
But at the same time,
Yeah.
her descent into madness is a tragic consequence of those very constraints.
It's like she wins by losing.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It is.
Her rebellion comes at the cost of her sanity,
It does.
highlighting the desperate measures women were often driven to in order to find any semblance of agency.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of the story.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront this uncomfortable truth
Okay.
that sometimes the only way to escape an oppressive system is to reject the very rules that define it.
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder if Gilman is suggesting that true freedom can only be found outside the confines of societal expectations.
Perhaps, but I think it also raises this really crucial question for us as readers.
Okay.
What are we willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of personal liberation?
Wow.
And how can we create a world where such drastic measures are no longer necessary?
Those are questions we all need to grapple with, both individually and collectively.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes the Yellow Wallpaper such a timeless and important work of literature.
It is.
It's not just a story.
Right.
It's a conversation starter.
Yes.
It challenges us to examine our own lives, our own wallpaper,
Yeah.
and to consider how we can break free from the patterns that are holding us back.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And I hope this deep dive has inspired you to do just that.
If you're interested in exploring this story further, we highly recommend reading the full text.
Yeah.
It's readily available online and in most libraries.
Absolutely.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes.
What resonated with you the most? What wallpaper are you ready to start peeling away in your own life?
Share your insights and reflections on our social media channels.
Yes.
Let's keep this conversation going.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Yellow Wallpaper.